Hello, everybody. Welcome to this sixth episode of Price Week with Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're going to be talking about his book, Bart Ehrman Interpreted: How One Radical New Testament Scholar Understands Another. Arguably, no scholar in the 21st century has had more of an important impact on public discussion and debate over the historical Jesus and the development of early Christianity than Bart D. Ehrman. I think that was an interesting point that you brought up in the back of the book. It does certainly appear that way. He's had a massive impact on historical Jesus studies. He's also, like yourself, he's written a bunch of books on the historical Jesus. And I noticed that you go through, you basically dissect and peel apart multiple points that Bart Ehrman makes. And it kind of reminds me of watching the debate that you and Bart Ehrman had a few years ago, in which a lot of the things that's discussed in this book also came up in that debate. Bart Ehrman relying on Galatians to make, Paul says James is the Lord's brother. So that must be evidence for historical Jesus. He uses the authenticity or the claim that Paul's letters are authentic, or some of them are authentic, to prove a historical Jesus. And one of the parts in the book that you mentioned is, I think you put it, Bart Ehrman downsizes Jesus to be historically tolerable. Could you talk about that?
This is where I guess I first came up with the thing that I've repeated ad nauseum, no doubt, that what he is doing, which is kind of typical of the guild of mainstream New Testament scholars, is to say, granted, the gospel portrait of Jesus is unbelievable as it stands. That to imagine this guy who's basically a Superman not attracting the attention of contemporary writers it makes sense only if you say that Jesus had been exaggerated by Christian propaganda, but that the original Jesus was much more modest, that he was an itinerant wise man, prophet, and rabbi, or some combination of those, and that he preached that the end of the world would shortly come and everybody ought to repent. And he made big waves doing this. But the more you take that approach, the more you whittle, as G.A. Wells said, the more you cut Jesus down to size, you're just trading one mystery for another one. Namely, why did anybody, including Christians, make such a big deal of this guy? I mean, how would he have been more noticeable than many of the rabbis of whom we hear only in the Mishnah because of 2 or 3 opinions they held on recondite matters? Why would anybody have taken the trouble? And so I, being, as you can tell, a fan of comic book superheroes and Superman in particular, I compare this to saying, suppose somebody insisted that there was a historical Superman, and they said, well, of course, nobody can leap tall buildings in a single bound, run faster than a speeding bullet, and all that kind of stuff. But there was a real guy at the core of it, and we've now successfully removed all the legends, and it turns out the historical the historical Superman was Clark Kent, a mild-mannered reporter for a great metropolitan newspaper.
And your point is, like, Clark Kent himself is even fictional.
And, well, that too, yeah. But suppose you figured, I mean, the way they're arguing, they're saying Clark Kent was enough to give rise to all the Superman mythology. That's absurd. And I think it's equally ridiculous in the case of Jesus. Like, how would you get from point A, the modest traveling rabbi, to the pre existent Son of God who died to save the world from its sins and rose from the dead and ascended into heaven? How would you get to that? I think that it's much more likely that what you have here is scholarly euhemerism. You, just like the ancient Greeks, you just can't let go of the idea that this childhood inspiration of yours, your theological teddy bear, was utterly fantastic. Just not at all in the real world. Uh, all right, I'll admit the big picture can't be true, but I'm still hanging on to a basic thing like, okay, there was no god Apollo, but he must have been the ancient owner of a tanning salon or something. It's just ridiculous, and it's psychologically motivated. I don't see how you can leap that gap, and he wants to do it. But again, as with most other things, Bart is safely ensconced with the in the midst of the magisterium of the consensus, which is why I've used the phrase "stuck in the middle with you" school of scholarship. And he hasn't changed much since he dropped Christian faith. He still has an essentially conservative, though not fundamentalism anymore, an essentially conservative view on the gospel tradition. And I think that is unwarranted, and that scholarship has passed him by, as with the whole guild to which he belongs. Of course, he's a textual critic first and foremost. That's what his doctorate is in, and I could never hope to match to begin to match his expertise in that field. I have great regard for Gordon Fee, another a teacher of mine, and Bruce Metzger, somebody who was Bart's doctor Vater, his guide in his studies, and a man I had a course with once. Yeah, these guys have an amazing grasp of the data that I will never have, but it's restricted to a particular corner of the vineyard, which I think, as James Barr said long ago, is a kind of a safe zone for people that want to pursue doctoral studies in New Testament, but not in such a way that will challenge their basic faith. And indeed, I'll shut up about this in a minute, but indeed, what finally led Bart to reject his childhood faith of evangelicalism? Well, it wasn't Jesus' questions. It was the problem of theodicy, the problem of evil. It just seemed unbelievable and implausible that the world could really be run by a providential, loving, righteous God. And I agree with him. But it wasn't. He didn't say, "Well, who can really know what early Christianity was like?" It was a whole different thing. I think had he followed that out, he might have come to the same sort of conclusion that many of us did for the same reason, but his was a different path, and I think it allows him more to be oblivious to certain questions.
I remember when I interviewed him last year, he would often bring up there's historical evidence for Jesus in hypothetical documents like Q, M, and L, pre-gospel material that has reliable data about a historical Jesus. And I know you talk about the Q document a lot in this book, and how Bart uses it or shouldn't use it as evidence for historical Jesus, but he does. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's not just the obvious fact that we don't actually have a copy of the Q document. I hope we will eventually. Maybe someone will discover it, or the L material or the M material and so forth. It's those are reasonable theories, but what they are theories about intra or intersynoptic relations. It's a way of
Right.
trying to slice the pie. Now, where would they have gotten this bunch of sayings or those stories? Because they didn't get them from here. Where would they have gotten it? Well, that can never be more than a kind of a paradigm, a heuristic model. It's not evidence in its own right, especially since all of these diagnoses of the Gospels are all debatable and highly debated. There may never have been such documents. And to assume there were, wait a minute, you are jumping the gun.
Right.
If we had copies, maybe, but we don't.
And I think what demonstrates the unreliability of the hypothetical documents is the fact there are so many different versions of these solution to the synoptic problem, like
Yeah.
Streeter's four document hypothesis, which is a mess, or the multi-source hypothesis, which I think is the oddest of them, because in the multi-source hypothesis, it is posited that the canonical gospels of Matthew and Luke actually did not borrow from the canonical gospel of Mark. And what this person does is he says there's two other versions of Mark, which he hypothesizes, Proto-Mark A and Proto-Mark B. And as far as he's concerned, Matthew is borrowing from Proto-Mark A and Luke is borrowing from Proto-Mark B. And the three Marks borrow from some super document called Proto, whatever that's supposed to be. And Matthew and Luke borrow from Q. I'm like, oh my goodness. And it's like, okay, how many marks does this guy think there were? It says, like, how many hypothetical marks does it take before we start saying something is wrong? Like Mark, Proto Mark A and B. I mean, it's just as hypothetical as the two source hypothesis. At least that one only has one document in there.
Yep, I always think that these alternate models that think they're simplifying the whole problem are not. Like if you say, well,
Right.
Matthew used Mark and then Luke used Matthew and Mark together. That's not unreasonable, but that would eliminate Q, you still have to ask, well, what the heck was L? We don't have a copy of
Right.
that either. And the same thing if you think Luke used Mark and Matthew used Luke and Mark. It may be true. Who knows? It seems unverifiable, but even if it is, it's kind of a lucky break. And like you mentioned, all the different marks, these things may be very complicated, but the more complicated they are, it's like a chain of weak
Indeed.
links.
Yeah.
And it can't be that if you're putting as much money in that bank as Bart is.
I think the argument that Matthew used Luke is, in my opinion at least, far superior than having to create hypothetical documents. Like I recently interviewed, it's not released yet, because there's a bunch of videos I haven't released yet. It's coming out. Professor Bartosz Adam Szynski, and he persuaded me that Matthew used Luke Acts. Now, what I find very fascinating about him is he says not only what I just mentioned, but he also goes further and says all the four documents, four gospels borrowed from Josephus.
Wow.
Yes. And furthermore, he says that Luke uses the Damascus document. And he says, I remember that he said, I really like the way he put this. I thought it was quite elegant. We cannot argue from documents we don't have, and we shouldn't. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but this is practically what he said. He says, he said that when it comes to Q, we have no manuscript control. And because we have no manuscript of it, and thus no manuscript control, people can say whatever they want about it. And I thought that was a great point, and it caused me to think about. It actually made me think, because like I used to think that the arguments for Q were pretty good until that interview. And I'm starting to think, oh, maybe it's a bit iffier than I thought, especially the way this guy put it. I have to say, I I thought his argument that Luke uses the Damascus document is fascinating because he was saying Luke seems closer to the Dead Sea Scrolls than Matthew, and that's one of his arguments. He uses that Luke is earlier than Matthew. Matthew's later because it's less familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, according to him. If I remember his argument correctly, he said that Luke has the parable of saving the man during the Sabbath, because in the Damascus document, it's the only document, Jewish document, that says that you can save someone during the Sabbath, but you cannot use tools because that's working tools to save somebody. So it's a bit tricky. And in Luke's gospel, basically Jesus talks about that. That yeah, you should save a man from drowning on the Sabbath. And it's like, oh, because he says simply because it's a Sabbath doesn't mean you shouldn't save someone's life. So in that sense, you could view Jesus as a Torah reformer, in which he says you shouldn't let a man die simply because you can't work on the Sabbath. And in Matthew's gospel, this is what Adam Shazinski is saying. It says we can notice that it says that in Matthew's gospel it says, what was it that it said? Okay, there we go. I almost forgot. It replaced the man being saved on the Sabbath with an animal. So Matthew, in his own way, is downplaying what's in Luke. And he's saying, oh, it's as if he's responding against Luke. Basically. I'm like, I thought that was an interesting argument.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, and Papias, and this is really what got me right here on top of everything he said. I took another look at Papias and realized, oh man, he said Matthew's sayings are more orderly than Luke's. Because he says Matthew's sayings of Jesus are orderly. So does that mean in the past tense there's something disorderly before Matthew? What are you talking about, Papias? He says there was a guy called Aristo who compiled the Logoi after Mark. I'm like, well, who else could have done that before Matthew and after Mark? One could argue, well, maybe he's talking about Q because Mark doesn't copy any sayings from Q because Q came after Mark. But on the other hand, if Luke in priority over Matthew is right, he's talking about Luke in between Mark and Matthew, not the Q document. And many studies of Luke's gospel indicates that his sayings of Christ are more chaotic than Matthew's, more primitive than Matthew's in many cases. So I personally think Papias was talking about Luke. And that could be the reason why Papias knows about the exploding Judas, because he's familiar with that. And because it's in there. And I know those like Dr. Dennis McDonald argues that the Q plus Papias hypothesis that, well, my solution to the synoptic problem, basically his solution to the synoptic problem, that is, but what he was telling me in the interview is that his solution to the synoptic problem is that Luke, Acts used Papias, Mark and Matthew, Papias and Mark used, also Matthew used the Q document. So he puts Papias in between Matthew and Luke Acts. And to me, that sounds a bit risky to do that. And I had to come to the conclusion, because I used to think his argument was a bit solid. Well, maybe not a bit solid, but it had a lot of good points. Until I realized that there's a stronger argument with Luke being before Matthew. And that makes it a bit unnecessary to go with such a complicated position like the Q plus Papias hypothesis. Before we continue with my other questions for you, Dr. Price, we have a super chat from Donnie Springer. Thank you for the follow. There is only one known fact about Jesus. A lot of lit written, all describing him as a man. Lit, I think you meant literature, yeah. Written, all describing him as a man, appearing as a man, in form of a man, etc. Point undisputed. What do you think, Dr. Price?
Does that mean that there's this element of doubt as to whether he actually was a flesh and blood human being, but rather
Yeah,
was in
I
the
think
form?
that's what he's saying. Yeah. Like it looks like, as you can see right here on the screen, the super chats there, he's saying the only known fact about Jesus is that we have a lot of literature written about him, describing him as a man, appearing as a man, in form of a man.
Hmm.
So that's all he's saying.
Yeah, and that would sort of fit the view of Marcus Vincent that Marcion wrote the original gospel because he seems to have a kind of docetism. And he
Mm,
says that the other gospels were uh, sort of pirate editions of Marcion's gospel, adding a bunch of other stuff, presumably
mm,
in the same way he got his narratives by rewriting Old Testament material. And well, he certainly would have said, yeah, he appeared in the likeness of a man, possibly paralleling Caspar Schwenkfeld's view in the Reformation times that yes, he did have a real body, but it was made of uh, star stuff or heavenly material. It was solid, but didn't come from human beings. Well, I mean, that we don't know. I mean, we don't have enough from Marcion to know exactly, but he does have him descend from heaven in the form of an adult. Or what kind of, that sounds kind of docetic. And if he was the first gospel writer, I guess you could say, well, still he must have been after these texts from the epistles that have him in the form of a man and things like that. Maybe he got it from that and thought, well, that's Paul's view, so it's good enough for me.
mm. You also talk about Bart's use of the testimonium. I think you called it the testimonium flimsius.
Flimsianum, yes. Yeah, I just am amazed at how it just seems absolutely clear to me that he is doing there by just chopping the stuff that would make it obvious Josephus, the Jew, who believed Vespasian was the Messiah, could not have written this. He says, well, we can snip that stuff out as Christian interpolations, but the rest of it is legit. Well, that's just what he says mythicists are doing when we point out the interpolative, if that's a word, character of some of these verses used to oppose mythicism, to refute it, like the James, I met no other apostles but Cephas and James, the Lord's brother. And the idea that on the night he was betrayed, he took a cup and bread, and several others, born of a woman, that these things are all interpolations. He says, well, the mythicists are cheating. They're just cutting that stuff, making them interpolations because they're inconvenient for their pet theory. I quoted about 7 scholars in that debate and again in the book who were the ones who first proposed that those passages were not original and showed that not one of them was a mythicist. That wasn't the issue for them. There were other reasons they decided, I think this may be secondary. And so that he was wrong about that. But he is that's what he's doing to try to anchor the historicity. Let's take a piece of bad evidence that seems to be an interpolation and trim it a bit and dress it up so that it becomes a good piece of evidence. I just think you got to be consistent, and that he isn't there.
Yeah, I think I see the point there. He also he also says that Acts, and I couldn't believe Bart Ehrman said this. This really was a turnoff for me. Bart says that Acts is ignorant of Paul's epistles. I'm like, how could you make that argument? It's at best, it's not mentioning the letters because it's it's trying to tell the reader that the letters weren't written yet when Paul lived in the years it's talking about. But how could you say it didn't know Paul? Even you argue that Acts used Paul's epistles. Acts was written after part of Galatians written, then the rest of Galatians is written after Acts. But for that to work, you have to say Acts knew the letters. May not mention them, but it has to. Well, what do you think about that, Bart Ehrman's argument?
Well, it's not completely implausible because there is a surprising absence of reference to them, but there's another very obvious explanation for that, that there's a similar absence of reference in most second century writing up and about Paul, until you get to Irenaeus and Tertullian, when they adopt the program of trying to co-opt Marcionism, and then they speak favorably of him, and there are fragmentary little mentions of Pauline epistles that sound kind of odd, as if Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp didn't exactly know the Pauline corpus as we do. That take up the epistle of Paul to you in Corinth. That sounds like he thought there was only one, or in another one, I think Ignatius or Polycarp. Well, I think it's Polycarp who says to the Philippians, in every one of his letters to you, Paul says so and so. How many did he think there were? And stuff like that. It makes you wonder, did they really know these things because they were too hot to handle? Is that why Acts doesn't mention them? But he knew about them, but he regarded Paul. He knew that Paul was reputedly, as Tertullian said, the apostle of Marcion and the apostle of the heretics. So it was like shunning the gospel of Thomas because it had bad associations. Those Gnostics use that gospel, so let's steer clear of it. Paul, I don't know about this guy. Let's rehabilitate him and co-opt him, but that's not going to include his letters until they hit upon the expedient of interpolating them and writing the pastorals to provide an orthodox lens through which to view them. But the silence, I think, was they just didn't want to notice this guy. They only wanted to give him a certain kind of credit, a subordinate of the Jerusalem apostles, and not exactly an apostle himself. And letters, nah.
Mm-hmm.
So he could be right. I mean, there are differences of opinion. Richard Purvo said he thought that Acts did use the epistles, but in a very not hesitating to rewrite them, like where they seem to overlap, but not quite, like Paul being lowered through the window over the city wall in a basket. That appears in both, Second Corinthians and in Acts, though it doesn't quite fit. But it's an odd thing. And so Purvo said, well, yeah, the one is based on the other, but it's rewritten somewhat fictively. That could be too, but I don't know. I don't know that we have enough evidence to say. It could just be that here is something that survived in two forms in the oral tradition about Paul. What a mess.
What do you think about the argument that if we can't find Jesus in the first century at all, let's just say screw it, he lived 100 years earlier. He's that character the Talmud's talking about. Jesus on a Pantera, crucified about the year 76 BCE under Alexander Jannaeus, the king of Israel. What do you think about that?
Well, I take that somewhat seriously in this sense. The fact that you have a Jewish tradition, which even Epiphanius, or however you say it, the Bishop of Salamis, took seriously enough to build some of it into his account of Jesus' genealogy and relations. He thought Jesus' grandfather was Pandera and stuff like this. And that Irenaeus thought Jesus lived to be 50 and was crucified under Claudius, not Tiberius. This all together makes me think that the people didn't really know when Jesus was supposed to have lived, and because he didn't, he was a myth, and there were various attempts to place him in history, just as Herodotus did with Hercules. He tries to say, well, now Hercules must have existed, but when? According to this myth, he knew King so and so, but according to that one, he was a contemporary of King so and so. I give up. But I see this as possibly like that. They couldn't even keep straight when he lived, when he was born and died. That seems kind of very strange to me, implying that there are competing theories as to when you ought to inject Jesus into history.
Brett Forsyth, thank you for the $10.
Mm.
Really appreciate it.
Mm.
Yeah, and he'll often go to Paul and say, even though he never met Jesus, and the thing is, I'll say that someone can meet somebody who met somebody else the other person didn't meet. But what Paul, when he argues that Paul never met Jesus but was contemporary with Jesus, Paul is such a big fan of Jesus. At least he portrayed himself that way, and even met James. I can't help but thinking, if it were really true, Paul was a contemporary of Jesus, I think Paul would have made an attempt to meet Jesus. And I think Jesus, the historical Jesus, would have been displeased with what Paul is saying about him. And since he got as far as meeting James, I think he could have easily met Jesus if he were living at the same time. And the other issue is, Paul keeps saying he had revelation from Jesus, a vision. He never met the man. But he does argue that he was born under the law, born of a woman. I know you said that's very strange, and he became a man and all those things. But you make the point that it's not really about Jesus necessarily. It's more about him responding, the letters responding against Marcion's theology. Could you explain that?
That Galatians is responding to Marcionism?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, this was not my original insight. I wish I could remember the name. If I remember to do it, I'll go look through issues of the Journal of Higher Criticism where we reprinted a paper by a scholar that argued that the account of Paul's conversion and what he did just afterward that appears in Galatians appears to be an attempt to rebut another account of the same events. And what do you know? It looks like it's point for point rejecting Acts's version of it. He says, when it pleased God to reveal his son in me, I didn't go to Jerusalem immediately. I went off to Arabia for 3 years. Why is he? I mean, it's like he's saying, contrary to popular belief, I did not go to see them because I thought they were more authoritative than my vision. It sounds like that he's trying to reject it, as with the whole thing with his account of the Jerusalem Council, that he's saying it's not quite what you think. It started well but ended badly, and so on and so on. That makes a lot of sense to me. I suspect that is the case. And then later in Galatians, you have odd parallels between what we read about Paul going to Jerusalem and what we read about Marcion going to Rome. making a big contribution, hoping to be recognized as an apostle or the bishop. And initially, yes, why not? And then later, get out of here. That
Hmm.
seems very striking to me. And I think about how in the Quran, Muhammad is defended by retelling stories of Abraham, Moses, and Noah, where they were persecuted and ridiculed, even with some of the same slurs that are recorded as Muhammad having received. So that they were trying to retroactively make these old patriarchs precedents for Muhammad. I wonder if the rest of Galatians is trying to do that by saying Marcion and Paul went through the same thing. And that would kind of fit into our last conversation about how some might have thought, I think this guy's really talking about himself. That Marcion is Paul, and if you also believe Paul was Simon, that would make Marcion Simon. But as to whether Paul could have met Jesus, Morton Smith says there's no reason not to take that passage in Second Corinthians literally. He says, if once we knew Christ according to the flesh, we don't know him that way anymore. And Smith says, I think that means that he did know Jesus during his life on earth. I have never been able to forget that. I don't know why we can be sure that's not what it means. Maybe whoever wrote this figured that, yeah, he did know him in the same way Peter and the others did, but it doesn't matter anymore. So if he differs from Peter, that's no disadvantage.
Dharma Defender, thank you for the $10. Why does Dr. Bart Ehrman constantly misrepresent mythicism? And why does he take such conservative positions on New Testament scholarship? He is more conservative and Metzger in some cases, like on the Q source.
Well, I always say I'm no mind reader. I don't know, but I have to suspect that he is so big on the consensus of scholars that to me it sounds as if he just can't resist committing the appeal to consensus fallacy. All the smart guys think this, and so if you don't, you must be an idiot. And it's like that's no reason for anything. I mean, if we went with that, we wouldn't believe in continental drift anymore because the guy that proposed it used to be dismissed as another Velikovsky, just a crank. But now it turns out they say, oh, gee, I guess that was a little premature of us. He was right. Well, who knows like what most scholars believe at a particular time. Just look at the whole history of biblical scholarship or any scholarship. The winds change as people notice new things they hadn't, and so forth. I just think he seems to be safely ensconced in an institutionalized community, and it's very difficult to see things any other way. I will not charge him with what I think is probably a ridiculous theory about him, that he knows where his bread is buttered, that if he came out as a mythicist, he'd lose his job, so he's not going to do that. I don't think that. But what I do think is it's very impossible. It's very improbable that someone is going to be able to think outside of a box which his colleagues share. And it's not being an intellectual hypocrite. It's not pretense. It's just a difference in perspective that it's hard to get past. And so that's what I think. He's never seen reason to reject that conservative paradigm, though I think though gradually he may be doing it, right? He used to think that the empty tomb was factual. Now he says, no, I was wrong. That's part of the legend. Who knows where he'll end up?
I think I forgot to read the final part of the final sentence in this question. He says he is more conservative than Metzger in some cases, like on the Q source. I don't think I read the
No,
full
you
sentence.
did. Yeah, I don't happen
I
to know
did?
what
Okay,
what
I've
Metzger
forgotten.
said about Q.
Hmm.
Um, but he's at least just as conservative on some things, like there weren't any pre-Christian dying and rising gods. Metzger made that argument. I think that is just demonstrably false, but it's part of an apologetics party line that Metzger was happy to embrace as an evangelical Christian. But Bart no longer is, though he was. And I suspect some of these things he just has not looked into deeply enough, or so I think. Like there are factors like the work of Geo Wiedengren in Sweden about the sacred king mythology, and the Dutch radical critics. It seems to me Bart is uninformed about these things. I pointed out parallels between the crucifixion accounts and contemporary Hellenistic novels, and he just scoffed at that and said there were no such novels. Well, I'm afraid there are. I can tell you what books to look up to read them. So he's too quick to dismiss things that he's not familiar with, as if,
Right.
well, if they were important, surely I'd know about them.
That's fallacious. Dahmer Defender, thank you for another $10. Why don't scholars take more seriously the view that the Gospels are myths and that Jesus was a myth like Osiris or Romulus, both of whom had biographies written about them, just as Jesus did?
Again, I think they've just inherited an orthodox paradigm, and it may be the last vestige of it that they hold to, but like they have usually departed, like Dennis MacDonald did. They've departed from orthodox belief theologically, but they still hold to enough of the traditional education they had, that it's going to be very hard for them to even see another view as possible. And again, who's going to be in a rush to do that if it means you can't play in the same playground of the SBL, for instance, anymore? I do want to walk the tightrope. I'm not confused. I'm not accusing anybody of just prevaricating and just upholding something they know is
Right.
not true. I just don't think that. But I do think there is this kind of plausibility structure, as Peter Berger called it. It just doesn't seem reasonable unless you make what Don Cupid called the leap of reason and try to jump up above and look at the competing paradigms and not favor either one of them. And that's hard to do.
So my final question for you in the stream is, what do you think about Dr. Ehrman's argument that the Philippians hymn to Christ was really a text being quoted by Paul, written decades earlier, written maybe as early as the 30s AD?
That chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, though he was
Yeah,
in
I
the
think
womb
that's
of
what it
Mary.
is. Yeah.
I suspect that I do find it pretty convincing that he isn't ultimately the author of this, and that it's part of a hymn um, that makes Jesus a heavenly Adam and so on. But it's not clear whether it's an interpolation by a Paulinist later, or a quote by Paul or somebody else of an early piece of hymnody. It's very difficult to say. I mean, it jumps out from the context because of the poetic meter and so forth. Just like Deuteronomy 32 about God apportioning the nations to his different sons. It's got a different poetic format than the prose around it. Does that mean the writer is using an old source like Deborah's song in Judges 6 or 7, wherever it is? Um, and I ask myself, if this was actually Paul, as early as we usually think he lived, would there be hymns like this already? I guess there could have been, but when people say he's quoting a creed in Romans 1, 3 through 4, Isn't it a little early to have stylized creeds? The Apostles' Creed was framed in the 2nd century. Were these things also later and just plugged back into early authoritative documents? As with virtually all these questions, there's no clear answer and no way to be sure, which is kind of maddening if you're interested in the stuff.
Jim Dubia, thank you for the $5 pop quiz. Everyone, please super chat these in the correct order. Q, Mark, Luke, Acts, Matthew, Papias, Marcion, Josephus. You will win a prize.
Well, if we're sure they existed, my guess would be Q would have been the first thing, Mark the second, Matthew the third, Luke, Acts the fourth, Papias just after them, and I guess I would wedge Josephus in right before the synoptics, which I think are 2nd century works. But that'd be my guess.
Well, thank you for joining me once again, Dr. Price. And remember, everybody, I'll be doing another show with Dr. Price tomorrow on the 7th and final episode of Price Week. And what's going to be on his book, Dr. Price's book, The Secret Scrolls.
That's what we're that's going to be fun.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.